Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 25, The Templars, Book 6, Chivalry, from Secret Societies of All Ages, Volume 1, by Charles William Heckethorn. 2. The Templars, 189, Foundation of the Order. It was founded in 1118, partly on a more ancient order, as would appear from a manuscript in the library of the Louvre entitled Ost sur les frères, Magie et Christ par un contemporain des chevaliers templiers qui en était. In the above year, 9 valiant and pious knights formed themselves into an association which united the characters of the monk and the knight. They selected for their patroness la douce Mere de Dieu and bound themselves to live according to the rules of Saint Augustine, swearing to consecrate their swords, arms, strength and lives to the defense of the mysteries of the Christian faith, to pay absolute obedience to the Grand Master, to encounter the dangers of the seas and of war whenever commanded, and for the love of Christ. And even when opposed singly to 3 infidel foes, not to retreat. They also took upon themselves the vows of chastity and poverty, promised not to go over to any other order, nor to surrender any wall or foot of land. King Baldwin II assigned them a portion of his palace, and as it stood near the church of the Temple, the abbot gave them a street leading from it to the palace, and hence they styled themselves Soldiery of the Temple, Militia Templi, 190. Progress of the Order. The first 9 years which elapsed after the institution of the Order, the Templars lived in great poverty. Hugh de Payens and Godfrey of St. Omer, the founders, had but 1 war horse between them, a fact commemorated on the seal of the Order, which represents 2 knights seated on 1 charger. Soon after, Pope Honorius confirmed the order and appointed a white mantle, to which Eugenius III affixed a red cross on the breast to be the distinguishing dress of the Templars. The order also assumed a banner formed of cloth, striped white and black, called beauséant, in Old French a piebald horse, which word became the battle cry of the knights. The banner bore a cross and the inscription Non nobis domine sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Thenceforth many knights joined the order, and numerous powerful princes bestowed considerable possessions upon it. Alfonso, King of Aragon and Navarre, even appointed the Templars his heirs, though the country refused to ratify the bequest. Thus they became the richest proprietors in Europe, until they possessed about 9,000 commanderies, situated in various countries of Europe and in Palestine, with an annual rental of 112 million francs. 191. Account of commanderies. Their commanderies were situated in their eastern and western provinces, the former embracing Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Cyprus, the latter Portugal, Castile and Leon, Aragon, France, including Flanders and the Netherlands, England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Italy and Sicily. Whilst Jerusalem was in the hands of the Christians, the chief seat of the Templars was in that city. Afterwards it was transferred to Paris, where they erected the large building until lately known as the Temple. It was in this building that Philip the Fair took refuge on the occasion of a riot which took place in 1306, where the Templars protected him until the fury of the people had calmed down. The knights, it is said, incautiously displayed to the royal cupidity their immense treasures. On a subsequent but far more momentous rising, the pile which served an ungrateful king for an asylum became the prison of an unfortunate successor. Recently, this memento of royal perfidy and of an avenging fate that struck the innocent has been leveled to the ground. 192. Imputations against the order. Towards the end of the 12th century, the order counted about 30,000 members, mostly French, and the Grand Master was generally chosen from among the French. Through the great number of their affiliated members, they could raise a large army in any part of the Eastern world, and their fleet monopolized the commerce of the Levant. Hence they departed from their original humility and piety. Palestine was lost, and they made no effort to recover it, but frequently drew the sword, which was only to be used in the service of God, as they understood the phrase, in the feuds and warfares of the countries they inhabited. They became proud and arrogant. When dying, Richard Sieur de Lion said, "I leave avarice to the Cistercian monks, luxuriousness to the begging friars, pride to the Templars," and yet perhaps they only felt their own power. The English Templars had dared to say to Henry III, "You shall be king as long as you are just." portentous words, which supplied matter for meditation to that Philip of France who, like many other princes, wished to be unjust with impunity. In Castile, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Knights of St. John combined against the king himself. Perhaps they aimed at universal dominion, or at the establishment of a Western sovereignty, like the Teutonic Knights of Prussia, the Hospitallers in Malta, or the Jesuits in Paraguay. But there is scarcely any ground for these imputations, especially the first, considering that the members of the order were scattered all over the earth, and might at the utmost have attempted to seize the government of some individual state, as that of Aragon, for instance, but not to carry out a scheme for which even the forces of Charlemagne had been inadequate. Accusations better founded were that they had disturbed the kingdom of Palestine by their rivalry with the Hospitallers, had concluded leagues with the infidels, had made war upon Cyprus and Antiochia, had dethroned the king of Jerusalem, Henry II, had devastated Greece and Thrace, had refused to contribute to the ransom of St. Louis, had declared for Aragon against Anjou an unpardonable crime in the eyes of France, with many other accusations. But their greatest crime was that of being exceedingly wealthy. Their downfall was therefore determined upon. 193. Plots against the order. Philip the Fair had spent his last sou. The victory of Mons, worse than a defeat, had ruined him. He was bound to restore Guyenne and was on the point of losing Flanders. Normandy had risen against a tax which he had been obliged to withdraw. The people of the capital were so opposed to the government that it had been found necessary to prohibit meetings of more than 5 persons. How was money to be obtained under these circumstances? The Jews could give no more because all they had been extorted from them by fines, imprisonment, and torture. It was necessary to have recourse to some grand confiscation without disgusting the classes on whom the royal power relied, and leading them to believe not that booty was aimed at, but the punishment of evildoers, to the greater glory of religion and the triumph of the law. At the instigation of Philip the Fair, libels were published against the Order of the Knights Templars, in which the most absurd charges were made against the members, accusing them of heresy, impiety, and worse crimes. Great weight was attached to the statements made against the Templars by 2 renegades of the order, the Florentine Roffi Dei and the Prior of Montfaucon, which latter, having been condemned by the Grand Master to imprisonment for life for his many crimes, made his escape and became the accuser of his former brethren. 194. Attentions paid to Grand Master. Bertrand de Got, who, by the influence of the French king, had become pope under the title of Clement V, was now urged by the former to fulfill the last of the 5 conditions on which the king had enabled him to ascend the chair of St. Peter. The first 4 conditions had been named, but Philip had reserved the naming of the 5th till the fit moment should arrive. And from his subsequent conduct, there can be no doubt that the destruction of the order of the Temple was the condition that was in the king's mind when he thus alluded to it. The first step was to get the Grand Master, James de Molay, into his power. At the request of the Pope that he would come to France to concert measures for the recovery of the Holy Land, he left Cyprus and came to Paris in 1307, accompanied by 60 knights, and bringing with him 150,000 florins of gold, and so much silver that it formed the lading of 12 horses, which he deposited in the temple in that city. To lull him into false security, the king, whose plan was not yet quite ripe for execution, treated the Grand Master with the greatest consideration, made him the godfather of one of his sons, and chose him with some of the most distinguished persons to carry the pall at the funeral of his sister-in-law. The following day he was arrested with all his suite, and letters having in the meantime been sent to the king's officers in the provinces on the 13th of October, 1307, to seize upon all the Templars, their houses and property, throughout the kingdom. Many thousand members of the order, knights and serving brothers, were thus made prisoners. 195. Charges against the Templars. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, and of spitting and trampling on the cross, of worshipping in a dark cave an idol in the figure of a man covered with an old human skin and having 2 bright and lustrous carbuncles for eyes, of anointing it with the fat of young children roasted, of looking upon it as their sovereign god, of worshipping the devil in the form of a cat, of burning the bodies of dead Templars and giving the ashes to the younger brethren to eat and drink mingled with their food. They were charged with various unnatural crimes, frightful debaucheries and superstitious abominations such as only madmen could have been guilty of and as could only be thought of in an age of frightful ignorance, stupidity and superstition. To make them confess these crimes, they were put to the torture, not only in France but also in England for Edward II, leagued with Philip to destroy the order. Many knights in the agonies of the torture confessed to the crimes they were charged with. Hundreds expired under it without making any confession. Many starved or killed themselves in other ways in prison. The trial was protracted for years. The persecution extended to other countries. In Germany and Spain and Cyprus, the order was acquitted of all guilt. In Italy, England and France, however, their doom was sealed, though for a moment there seemed a chance of their escaping, for the Pope, seeing that Philip and Edward had seized all the money and estates of the Templars and seemed inclined to deprive him of his share of the spoil, began to side with the order. But on some concessions being made to him by the two kings, he again supported them, though in the end we find him complaining of the small share of the booty that came into his hands. 196. Burning of knights. The tedious progress of the sham trial was occasionally enlivened by the public execution of knights who refused to acknowledge crimes of which they were not guilty. 59 gallant knights were led forth in one day to the fields at the back of the nunnery of Saint Antoine, where stakes had been driven into the ground and faggots and charcoal collected. The knights were offered pardon if they would confess, but they all refused and were burned by slow fires, that is, clear charcoal fires. At Senlis, 9 were burned and many more in other places. On all these occasions, as well as in the awful scenes of the torture chamber, the Dominican friars were the mocking witnesses. 197. James de Molay. The Grand Master remained in prison 5 years and a half, and there is no doubt that he was repeatedly put to the torture. The confession he was said to have made was probably a forgery. Finally, on the 18th of March, 1313, he and Guy, the Grand Preceptor of the Order, were burnt by a slow fire on a small island in the Seine between the Royal Gardens and the Church of the Hermit Brethren, where afterwards the statue of Henry IV was erected, both to the last moment asserting the innocence of the Order. 198. Mysteries of the Knights Templars. Without laying too much stress on confessions extorted by violence or denunciations proceeding from revenge, cupidity and civility, it is manifest that the Templars, in their ordinances, creed and rites, had something which was peculiar and secret, and totally different from the statutes, opinions and ceremonies of other religio-military associations. Their long sojourn in the East, in that dangerous Palestine which overflowed with schismatic Greeks and heretics, who, driven from Constantinople, took refuge with the Arabs, their rivalry with the Hospitallers, their contact with the Saracen element, finally the loss of the Holy Land, which injured them in the opinion of the world and rendered their lives idle, all these and many other circumstances would act on this institution in an unforeseen manner, differing from the tendencies of the original constitution, and mix up therewith ideas and practices little in accordance with, nay, in total antagonism to, the orthodox thought that had originated, animated, and strengthened this military brotherhood. 199. The Temple and the Church. The very name may, in a certain manner, point to a rebellious ambition. Temple is a more august, a vaster and more comprehensive denomination than that of church. The temple is above the church. This latter has a date of its foundation, a local habitation. The former has always existed. Churches fall. The temple remains as a symbol of the parentage of religions and the perpetuity of their spirit. The Templars might thus consider themselves as the priests of that religion, not transitory but permanent. And the aspirants could believe that the order constituting them the defenders of the temple intended to initiate them into a second and better Christianity, into a purer religion. Whilst the temple meant for the Christian the Holy Sepulchre, it recalled to the Mussulman the Temple of Solomon, and the legend which referred to this latter served as a bond to the rituals of the Freemasons and other secret societies. Further, the church might be called the house of Christ, but the temple was the house of the Holy Spirit. It was that religion of the spirit which the Templars inherited from the Manichaeans, from the Albigenses, from the sectarian chivalry that had preceded them. The initiatory practices, the monuments, even the trial, showed this prevalence of the religion of the spirit in the secret doctrines of the temple. The Templars drew a great portion of their sectarian and heterodox tendencies from that period in which chivalry, purified and organized, became a pilgrimage in search of the Sangreal, the mystic cup that received the blood of the Savior, from that epoch in which the East, in invasions armed and unarmed, with the science of the Arabs, with poetry and heresies, had turned upon the West. 200. Initiation. Much has been said about the mode of initiation, that it took place at night in the chapel, in the presence of the chapter, all strangers being strictly excluded, that licentious rites attended it, and that the candidate was compelled to deny, curse, and spit upon the cross, that cross for which they had shed so much of their own blood, sacrificed so many of their own lives. We have seen that this was one of the chief accusations brought against the order. Was there any truth in it? It seems most probable there was, but the practice may be explained as in the following paragraph. 201. Cursing and spitting on the cross explained. Such a practice need not surprise us in an age in which churches were turned into theaters, in which sacred things were profaned by grotesque representations, in which the ancient mysteries were reproduced to do honor in their way to Christ and the saints. The reader may also bear in mind the extraordinary scenes afterwards represented in the miracle plays. Now, the aspirant to the Templar degree was at first introduced as a sinner, a bad Christian, a renegade. He denied, in fact, after the manner of St. Peter, and the renunciation was frequently expressed by the odious act of spitting on the cross. The fraternity undertook to restore this renegade, to raise him all the higher the greater his fall had been. Thus, at the Festival of the Idiots, the candidate presented himself, as it were, in a state of imbecility and of degradation, to be regenerated by the Church. These comedies, rightly understood at first, were in course of time falsely interpreted, scandalizing the faithful who had lost the key of the enigma. The Templars had adopted similar ceremonies. They were scions of the Cathari and Manichaeans. Now the Cathari despised the cross and considered it meritorious to tread it underfoot. But with the Templars, this ceremony was symbolical, as was abundantly proved during their trial, and had indeed reference to Peter's thrice-repeated denial of Christ. 202. Charge of licentious practices. As to licentious rites, if any such ever were practiced, they were confined to certain localities and certain degrees of initiation. For it appeared at the trials that many knights had never even heard of the practices they were charged with, that they had never seen the bust of the Baphomet, that they had never been invited or asked to take part in licentious or blasphemous rites. If certain members of the order were cognizant of and participated in such, their offenses were individual offenses, and not crimes which the order and its teaching could be reproached with. Unnatural crimes, however, were so common in the days of the Templars that they might safely be charged with them, without at once raising a cry of indignation and a sense of incredulity at the mere accusation itself. For in the age of the Templars, it was customary on the election of a bishop to insist on the candidate swearing that he was not guilty of sodomy, seducing nuns, or bestiality. Had these vices not been very common, every honest man would at once have exclaimed, "Nolo episcopari." All the charges brought against the Templars had been previously made against the Cathari, the Albigenses, and against the Hospitallers. And Clement, in a bull dated but 4 days after that of the suppression, acknowledged that the whole of the evidence against the order amounted only to suspicion. 203. The Templars, the opponents of the Pope. But there may have been another and special reason for introducing this ceremony and ever keeping the treachery of Peter before the minds of the members of the order. We have seen that the Templars, during and in consequence of their sojourn in the East, attached themselves to the doctrines of the Gnostics, and Manichaeans, as is sufficiently attested, were other proofs wanting, by the Gnostic and Kabbalistic symbols discovered in and on the tombs of Knights Templars, which appeared to them less perverted than those of the priest of Rome. They also knew the bad success the proclamation of Christ's death on the cross had had at Athens. In consequence of Aeschylus's tragedy, Prometheus Vinctus, wherein Oceanus denied his friend when God made him the sacrifice for the sins of mankind, just as Peter, who lived by the ocean, did with regard to Christ. The Templars, therefore, came to the conclusion that all these gods, descended from the same origin, were only religious and poetic figures of the sun. And seeing the bad use made of the doctrines connected therewith by the clergy, they renounced St. Peter and became Johannites, or followers of St. John. There was thus a secret schism, and according to some writers it was this, together with the opposition to Roman Catholicism which it implied, as well as their great wealth, which was among the causes of their condemnation by the court of Rome. 204. Baphomet. The above explanation may also afford a clue to the meaning and name of the idol the Templars were accused of worshipping. This idol represented a man with a long white beard, and the name given to it was Baphomet, a name which has exercised the ingenuity of many critics, but the only conclusions arrived at by any of them as to the meaning of the name, and deserving consideration, is that of Nicolai, who assumed that it is composed of the words for the baptism of wisdom, and that the image represented God, the universal Father. As to the meaning of the head itself, we have already referred to the Gnostic and Kabbalistic doctrines and symbols adopted by the Templars, and the head worshipped by them certainly was one of these symbols. We know that the Kabbalists represented God in abstracto by a head without a beard, whilst the creative God was represented by a bearded head. The former symbolized unchangeableness, the latter the constant growth seen in the world. To the Templars, the bust was the one God. When it was shown to the initiated, the Hierophant pronounced the Arabic word Yalla, corrupted from each Allah, the light of God, and the new member was addressed as a friend of God. But a denial of the Trinity in those days involved racks and faggots. Hence it became sufficiently plain why the secret was looked upon as inviolable, and was so well kept by the Templars that we can only conjecture its import. 205. Disposal of the possessions of the Templars. The order having been suppressed by a papal bull dated the 6th of May 1312, the king and the pope converted to their own use the movable property of the order under their respective jurisdictions, the king keeping, as we have seen, the lion's share. Its other possessions in France and Italy were, sorely against the will of the king, assigned to the order of the Hospitallers, who were, however, obliged to pay such large fines to the king and pope as completely impoverished them for the time. A portion of their German estates was assigned to the Teutonic Knights. The Spanish possessions of the Templars, consisting of 17 towns and castles, were secured by the king for the foundation of the Order of Our Lady of Montesa, whose object was as barbarous as any Christian pope or king could devise, namely, to combat the Moors. And the King of Portugal, who did not violently suppress the order, made it change its name to that of the Order of Christ, which exists to this day, and since 1789 consists of 3 classes: Grand Cross, Commander, and Knight. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.